The people of Meadowbrook will always remember this day. A 2-year-old girl named Lily Thompson was brutally killed by a lion. But what led to this incident? Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this shocking case. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Thompson family's small home, casting a warm glow over the kitchen table where Sarah Thompson was packing a small bag with snacks and juice boxes. It was a day they had been anticipating for weeks, a family trip to Meadowbrook Zoo, a long-awaited adventure for their 2-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily Loudon ducked. The crisp autumn air carried the faintest hint of the approaching winter, but the sky was clear, the kind of perfect day that felt designed for making memories. Lily had been talking about the zoo for days, her tiny voice filled with excitement every time she pointed to the picture of a lion in her favorite bedtime book. She was fascinated by the animal, enchanted by the idea of its golden mane and deep, rumbling roar. To her, lions weren't just animals. They were magical creatures from stories and dreams. Today, she would see one in real life. The drive to Meadowbrook Zoo was filled with the kind of easygoing joy that only family outings could bring. Lily sat in her car seat, kicking her legs excitedly, her small hands clutching her stuffed bunny, a toy that never left her side. Sarah glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, smiling at the way her wide brown eyes scanned the passing scenery, as if she expected to see a lion walking alongside the car at any moment. James, her father, hummed along to a children's song playing softly from the radio, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching back to tickle Lily's foot, earning giggles that filled the car with warmth. The entrance to Meadowbrook Zoo was bustling with families, the air filled with the sounds of laughter, excited chatter, and the occasional distant call of animals from their enclosures. Children ran ahead of their parents, pointing at the brightly colored signs that directed visitors to different exhibits. The smell of popcorn and cotton candy lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp scent of fallen leaves scattered along the pathways. For Lily, the zoo was a wonderland. Every enclosure, every animal, every tiny detail was something new, something exciting. She marveled at the flamingos standing on one leg, their pink feathers glowing under the sunlight. She pressed her face against the glass at the aquarium exhibit, watching in awe as otters twisted and turned in the water. She giggled when the giraffes bent their long necks to nibble on leaves from a feeding station, their dark tongues flicking out to grasp the food. Every experience was met with pure joy, every new sight filling her with a sense of wonder. Sarah and James followed closely behind, watching their daughter's reactions with the kind of love that only parents understood. They took turns lifting her up so she could see better, took pictures of her pointing excitedly at a baby elephant playing in the mud, held her small hand as she toddled along the paved paths. The day was perfect in its simplicity, a rare moment of uninterrupted happiness. As they made their way through the zoo, the excitement in Lily's tiny frame only grew. She knew where they were headed next. She could see the sign up ahead, the lion exhibit, her favorite animal, the one she had been waiting for. Her fingers tightened around her stuffed bunny as she tugged on her mother's hand, urging them forward. The Meadowbrook Zoo's lion enclosure was one of its most impressive attractions. Designed to resemble the African savanna, it featured a vast open space with tall grasses, scattered trees, and a towering rock formation where the lions often lounged in the afternoon sun. A reinforced glass barrier and a sturdy railing separated visitors from the animals, ensuring safety while still allowing an up-close view of the powerful creatures within. A crowd had gathered around the observation area, families pressing against the railing to get a better look. The main attraction was Mufasa, the zoo's dominant male lion. He lay atop the highest rock, his golden mane catching the sunlight, his body stretched out in the lazy confidence of a predator with nothing to fear. Every so often, his tail flicked, his ears twitching, as he listened to the murmurs of the crowd. Lily's eyes widened as she took in the sight. The lion was even bigger than she had imagined, more majestic than the ones in her picture books. She was mesmerized. The world around her faded away. There was only Mufasa, only this perfect moment. She pulled away from her mother's grasp, moving closer to the railing, her tiny fingers wrapping around the cool metal as she leaned forward to get a better look. The noise of the crowd, the shuffling of people moving to get a better view, the distant sounds of other animals, It all blurred into the background. Sarah, momentarily distracted by another child bumping into her, loosened her grip on Lily's hand for just a second. It was all it took. A small misstep, a shift in weight, a moment of imbalance, and then, before anyone could react, Lily was gone. She had slipped through a small opening in the railing. An opening that shouldn't have existed. A gap unnoticed until it was too late. A gasp rippled through the crowd as people turned, realizing what had happened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. Lily was no longer on the safe side of the barrier. She was inside the lion enclosure. A heartbeat passed in silence. Then the screaming began. It happened in an instant, a moment so brief that no one could have anticipated the horror that followed. The sun shone brightly over Meadowbrook Zoo, casting golden light over the lion enclosure where families gathered to witness the majestic creatures in their artificial savanna. Parents held their children up so they could see, cameras clicked, and voices murmured in awe as Mufasa, the enormous male lion, shifted lazily atop his rock. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of perfect afternoon that felt timeless. But in the crowd, unnoticed until it was too late, one small mistake was unfolding. Lily Thompson had been mesmerized by the lion since the moment she laid eyes on him. The creature was bigger than she had imagined, his golden mane thick and full, his deep amber eyes surveying the world with quiet authority. She had seen lions in her books, had dreamed about them, had traced their shapes with her small fingers on the pages of her favorite bedtime stories. But now, he was real. He was there, just beyond the railing, just out of reach. She pressed forward, her tiny hands gripping the metal bar separating her from the enclosure. Her parents were beside her, Sarah holding a small bag of snacks, James watching the lion with quiet admiration. They were right there, inches away, but in a crowd as dense as this one, distractions came easily. A child behind them squealed in excitement, bumping into Sarah just as she reached to steady Lily. It was the smallest disruption, a mere shift in attention, a fleeting moment where the focus wavered. Sarah let go of Lily's hand for only a second, her body adjusting to the unexpected push from behind. That was all it took. Lily, eager to get closer, lifted herself onto the lower railing. It was something children did all the time. An innocent move meant only to gain a better view. But she was small, barely 2 feet tall, her body light and unsteady. As she shifted her weight, her foot slipped against the smooth metal. The forward momentum was already there, carrying her tiny frame toward the barrier. And then, in an instant, she was gone. The fall was short but devastating. The enclosure's outer barrier had been designed to prevent anyone from reaching over. But near the base, where the metal met the observation ledge, a small gap had formed over time. An imperfection unnoticed by staff, a minor flaw in an otherwise flawless design. It was not large enough for an adult, not even for an older child. But for someone as small as Lily, it was enough. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the sudden intake of breath as onlookers registered what had just happened. Sarah's heart seized in her chest, her mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes had seen. One moment, her daughter had been there, her small fingers wrapped around the railing, her bright yellow dress glowing in the afternoon sun. The next, she was falling, her tiny body tumbling forward, arms outstretched as if trying to grasp the air itself. The sound of her impact against the dry grass below was eerily soft, almost insignificant against the rising tide of panic. For a second, everything was silent, and then the screaming began. Sarah lunged forward, her instincts overriding everything else. But hands grabbed her, pulling her back, voices shouting at her that she couldn't go down there, that it was too dangerous. James was already trying to scale the railing, his face twisted in horror, but zoo staff were moving toward him, holding him back, yelling into their radios for immediate assistance. Inside the enclosure, Lily stirred. The fall had dazed her, but it had not broken her. She sat up, her small body trembling, her head turning as she tried to understand where she was. The world around her was unfamiliar. The tall, dry grass swayed in the breeze, the scent of earth and animal thick in the air. Above her, voices screamed her name, but she did not look up. She was too small to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened, but Mufasa understood. From his perch on the highest rock, the lion's golden eyes locked onto the tiny intruder now inside his territory. His body, once languid and relaxed, tensed ever so slightly. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of something unfamiliar, something that did not belong. The instincts buried deep within him, the ones no captivity could ever erase, began to stir. Zoo staff were already moving into action, racing toward the security panel that controlled the emergency gates, shouting into radios trying to assess the situation. A tranquilizer gun was being prepared, but they all knew it would take time they did not have. The protocol was clear. Keep the animal distracted, create distance, give the child a chance to be pulled to safety. One of the keepers, a man who had worked with Mufasa for years, grabbed a bucket of raw meat and flung a large chunk into the enclosure. The red mass landed with a dull thud, the scent of fresh flesh filling the air. Normally, it would have been an instant distraction, a guaranteed way to redirect the lion's attention, but Mufasa didn't move. His eyes never left the child. Lily, still unaware of the danger, tried to push herself to her feet. Her legs were wobbly, her balance uncertain. She swayed slightly, the impact of the fall still affecting her. And then, she made the mistake that sealed her fate. She cried, a soft, confused whimper escaped her lips, barely audible to the frantic crowd above. But to Mufasa, it was a sound that triggered something deep inside him, a sign of vulnerability, a sign of prey. Our climb was over. Our journey had about come to a conclusion. We would all sit on it for a long time. The lion moved. His muscles rippled beneath his golden fur as he rose to his full height, his massive body descending from the rock with effortless grace. The shift was instant, from a resting predator to a hunter who had locked onto his target. His paws barely made a sound as he crossed the distance between them, his steps slow and deliberate. Lily turned, her big brown eyes finally meeting his. The moment stretched, impossibly long and unbearably short. The tranquilizer gun was raised, a shot fired. The dart struck Mufasa's side, embedding into the thick fur near his shoulder. But he did not stop. The drugs would take time to work. Precious time that no one had. Above, Sarah collapsed against the railing, her screams blending with the desperate shouts of the staff. James fought against the hands holding him back, his body twisting in futile attempts to reach his daughter. And below, in the dry grass of the enclosure, the last thing Lily saw was the golden mane of the lion rushing toward her. Mufasa had spent years in captivity, but the instincts that had shaped his kind for millennia had never left him. He had been born in a breeding program, raised under the careful eyes of zookeepers who had fed him, cared for him, ensured he never knew the hunger or struggle that his ancestors had faced in the wild. He had never stalked prey across the African plains, had never fought for his meals, had never chased down a fleeing creature in the final moments before the kill. And yet, none of that mattered. The wildness within him had never been erased, only buried beneath the monotony of his days, waiting for something to awaken it. And now, it had. The tiny figure in the enclosure was not supposed to be there. Mufasa's golden eyes tracked the small, trembling child as she struggled to her feet, the scent of her fear cutting through the familiar smells of his enclosure. His ears twitched, adjusting to the chaos unfolding beyond the fence. The screaming voices, the urgent shouts, the clicking of cameras capturing a tragedy in real time. But none of that mattered. The world beyond the barrier had never been his concern. His reality existed within these walls, within the boundaries that had defined his life since birth. And now something foreign had entered that space. Something vulnerable, his muscles coiled beneath his thick fur, his body lowering into a slow, predatory crouch. His tail flicked once, a subconscious motion that signaled his focus narrowing, his instincts sharpening. The zookeepers were moving. He could hear their footsteps, smell the raw meat they were throwing to divert his attention. But it wasn't enough. The fresh blood dripping onto the grass should have been irresistible, should have drawn him away, but his focus never wavered. The meat was familiar, it was routine, but the child, she was something new. Every fiber of his being recognized the moment for what it was. In the wild, predators did not hesitate. Hesitation meant starvation, meant weakness, meant death. There was no logic to override what had been ingrained into him by nature itself. The sound of the child's whimper, the trembling of her tiny frame, the uncertainty in her movements, everything about her signaled vulnerability. His instincts did not register her as a human child. They did not care that she was something different, something that should not be harmed. In this moment, in the world his mind understood, she was something small and fragile in his domain, and that meant one thing: she was prey. The energy in the enclosure shifted. 1 second, Mufasa was still. The next, he moved. His massive paws crossed the ground with terrifying speed, his body covering the distance between them in an instant. The tranquilizer dart hit his shoulder, but it was nothing more than a pinprick against his thick hide. The drugs inside it would take time to work, and time was something the child did not have. The air above the enclosure erupted in chaos. The zoo guests screamed, voices rising in horrified unison, mothers clutching their own children to their chests, fathers turning away, unable to watch what they knew was about to happen. Zookeepers shouted orders into their radios, but their voices were drowned out by the raw, uncontrolled panic of the crowd. Lily stumbled backward, her tiny frame barely able to support itself after the fall. She turned, as if sensing what was coming, as if some primal part of her, buried beneath innocence and inexperience, recognized the danger too late. Her big brown eyes locked onto the lion just as he lunged. Mufasa's powerful front paw struck first, his massive claws hooking into the delicate fabric of her dress, knocking her off balance. Her body hit the ground hard, her cry swallowed by the deafening roar that finally erupted from the lion's throat. It was a sound that had once echoed across the African plains, a sound meant to instill terror in creatures much larger than the child now pinned beneath him. The world outside the enclosure no longer existed for him. There was no glass, no railing, no hundreds of people watching from above. There was only the earth beneath his paws, the weight of his body pressing down on the struggling form beneath him, the rapid beat of a tiny heart against his claws. The tranquilizer was starting to take effect, but it was too slow. His vision blurred slightly at the edges, his movements beginning to feel sluggish, but the instinct remained. He lowered his massive head, his jaws parting, canines flashing in the golden light of the afternoon sun. A second dart struck him, embedding itself in his side. His muscles twitched, his breath coming heavier now, his vision darkening. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Lily's body slackened beneath him. But it was already too late. The screaming above reached its peak. People sobbed openly, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Zookeepers rushed forward, armed with poles and shields, but there was nothing left to save. The lion swayed slightly, the tranquilizer finally taking full effect, his massive body stumbling backward. His golden eyes, once filled with the sharpness of the hunt, dulled as the drugs coursed through his veins. He let out a low, heavy breath, his legs giving way beneath him. His massive frame collapsed onto the ground, dust rising in the air around him. The world slowed. The chaos continued above, but inside the enclosure, everything was still. Lily lay motionless in the dry grass. Her small fingers, which had only hours before clutched her stuffed bunny with excitement, twitched slightly. But the fight was already gone. Her body, so fragile against the weight of a predator designed for power, had given up. Mufasa's breathing was labored now, his chest rising and falling in uneven, heavy intervals. His golden mane, once a thing of pride and beauty, was matted with dust. His body had been conquered, not by another lion, not by a rival, but by something he could never have understood. The last thing he saw before darkness overtook him was the lifeless form in front of him, the tiny figure that had unknowingly awakened something deep within him. The instincts that had defined him, had been his undoing, and the child, who had once marveled at his kind, had been its final victim. The moment Lily hit the ground inside the lion enclosure, time fractured. Everything that followed happened in seconds, but to those watching, it stretched unbearably, a slow mission descent into horror. The panic began as a ripple, a collective gasp that swelled into a wave of screams as the reality of the situation set in. A child had fallen into the habitat of one of the most powerful predators on Earth, and there was nothing but open space between her and the lion that now regarded her with chilling focus. The zookeepers were already moving before the crowd had fully registered the danger. Years of training dictated their actions, muscle memory taking over as they sprinted toward the emergency controls. Every second mattered. In the best-case scenario, they could lure Mufasa away, lock him into a separate holding area, and retrieve the child before he had the chance to react. But best-case scenarios rarely unfolded in real life, and the window of time they had to act was closing fast. One of the keepers reached for the emergency feeding bucket, grabbing fistfuls of raw meat and flinging them toward the far end of the enclosure. The scent of blood filled the air, a desperate attempt to redirect the lion's attention. In almost any other circumstance, it would have worked. Mufasa had been conditioned over years to associate food with his keepers, responding instantly to the signals they used to guide his movements. But this was different. This was not a routine feeding. This was instinct. At its most primal, the lion did not so much as glance at the meat. His entire body had tensed, his gaze locked on the small, unfamiliar figure that had landed within his domain. His world, which had been unchanged for years, had been disrupted, and his instincts had taken control. He was a hunter. The child was small, helpless, vulnerable, the perfect target. The emergency sirens blared across the zoo, a sharp, piercing sound meant to alert staff that a containment breach had occurred. The crowd pressed against the barriers, horrified faces frozen in expressions of shock, parents clutching their own children in white-knuckled grips. Security personnel rushed to secure the perimeter, pushing people back, trying to maintain control of a situation that was already spiraling out of their grasp. Inside the enclosure, Lily tried to stand. She was too young to understand the terror surrounding her, too disoriented from the fall to comprehend the danger that loomed just feet away. Her small hands pressed against the dirt, her legs trembling as she struggled to push herself upright. The movement triggered something in Mufasa. His ears pricked forward, his tail flicked. He moved. The reaction was immediate. The crowd above erupted into fresh screams, and the zookeepers scrambled to deploy their final option: tranquilizers. The gun was raised, the first dart fired. It struck Mufasa's shoulder, embedding itself into the thick fur. A successful hit, but tranquilizers were not an instant solution. It would take minutes for the drug to take effect, and they did not have minutes. Mufasa took another step forward. The second dart was fired. Another hit, this time to his flank. The lion twitched, a slight hesitation in his movements, but he did not stop. His body had already committed to the hunt, his mind locked onto its target. The drugs were starting to work, but not fast enough. A final, desperate effort was made to distract him. A keeper rushed forward with a riot shield, banging against the metal in an attempt to startle the lion. Another hurled more meat, screaming his name in a voice he had known since birth. For a moment, the tactic seemed to work. Mufasa paused, his head turned slightly, his attention wavering. But then Lily whimpered. The sound was barely audible over the chaos, but to Mufasa, it was deafening. It was the sound of weakness, of prey caught in the final moments before the inevitable. His hesitation vanished, his muscles tensed, his body launched forward. The third dart hit him mid-air, the tranquilizer surging through his system, but the moment of impact had already arrived. Above, Sarah collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing with sobs. James fought against the arms holding him back, his face twisted in horror. The world had slowed to a crawl, but it was too late. The race against time had already been lost. The moment of impact sent a shudder through the entire zoo, an irreversible fracture in time where horror became reality. The powerful body of the lion collided with the fragile frame of the child, an unthinkable contrast between predator and prey. The world outside the enclosure had erupted into chaos, but inside, there was only the inevitability of what had already begun. The tranquilizer was working, slowing Mufasa's movements, dulling his reactions, but it was not fast enough to stop the moment that had already sealed Lily's fate. Her small body crumpled beneath the force, her frame too delicate to withstand the weight of a creature built for destruction. The air had been filled with screams, hundreds of voices blending into one terrible chorus. But in that instant, it was as if the world had gone silent. The watching crowd had frozen in their horror, breath caught in their throats, unable to process what they had just seen. A mother's wail cut through the paralysis, raw and unfiltered, the kind of sound that did not belong in a place meant for joy. Mufasa's instincts had won. His body was slowing now, his head drooping, his limbs unsteady as the tranquilizer forced its way through his bloodstream. His jaws had never fully closed. His grip had not tightened the way it would have in a true hunt. The chemicals dulled his reaction, but not before the damage was done. He staggered, his massive paws shifting, his balance wavering. The golden glow of his eyes flickered, the last vestiges of his focus slipping away as the tranquilizer overtook him. He took one last unsteady step before his body collapsed. Beside the motionless child, the zookeepers rushed forward, moving in a blur of frantic motion. The air was filled with urgent shouts, commands exchanged in voices that could barely contain their panic. The gate to the secondary holding area had been opened, and other keepers were already inside, securing the lion. But it no longer mattered. Mufasa's body lay still, his breathing deep and drugged, the predator that had existed moments ago reduced to a sleeping shell of what he had been. The priority was now the child. A medic knelt beside Lily, hands moving quickly, searching for signs of life. The stillness of her body was unbearable, the way she remained untouched by the chaos surrounding her. Her yellow dress, once so bright in the sunlight, was dust-streaked and torn, a silent testament to the violence that had occurred. The plush bunny she had clung to all morning lay just inches from her outstretched fingers, abandoned in the grass. The minutes stretched, unbearable and endless, as the medical team worked. The crowd above had been pushed back, but their presence still loomed. A sea of pale faces, of hands clutched over mouths, of eyes wet with tears for a child they had never met. The energy in the air shifted from panic to something quieter, something heavier, something that settled into the bones of everyone who had witnessed what should have been impossible. And then the final confirmation: Lily Thompson was gone. The announcement did not come loudly. It did not need to. The way the medic lowered their head, the way the zookeepers stopped moving, the way Sarah's sobs turned from desperate to hollow, it was enough. The weight of reality sank into every person who had been there, pressing down with an unbearable force. There was no rewinding, no undoing, no taking back the moment that had turned a day of excitement into one of devastation. The park shut down immediately. The remaining visitors ushered out as staff worked to contain both the scene and the hysteria. A perimeter was secured around the enclosure, yellow tape stretching across the railings as officials arrived to begin their investigation. The media would arrive soon, their cameras ready to capture the aftermath of tragedy, their voices eager to dissect the sequence of failures that had led to this moment. But in the end, the explanations would not matter. The safety measures, the railing that had failed, the protocols that had not been fast enough, it was all meaningless in the face of what had been lost. A little girl who had come to see the lions, who had dreamed of them, who had adored them, had been taken by the very creature she had admired. And Meadowbrook Zoo, a place built for joy, would never be the same again. The tragedy at Meadowbrook Zoo did not end when the gates closed that evening, nor did it fade when the last visitor was escorted out. The weight of what had happened lingered in the air, pressing down on the empty walkways, settling into the bones of the staff who had watched helplessly as a life was lost. The silence that followed was unlike anything the zoo had ever known. It was not the natural quiet of an after-hours facility, but something heavier, something unnatural, a hollow absence where life had once thrived. News of Lily Thompson's death spread with uncontrollable speed. Within hours, headlines screamed about the horror that had unfolded in the lion enclosure, about the little girl who had fallen where no child should have been, about the terrible moment when the line between human and animal had shattered in the worst way imaginable. Images of the scene, grieving parents, panicked crowds, stunned zookeepers, flashed across television screens, accompanied by the unrelenting voices of anchors and experts dissecting every aspect of the incident. The world wanted answers. They wanted blame. They wanted to understand how something so unthinkable could have happened in a place designed for wonder. Investigators arrived early the next morning, their presence somber and methodical. They combed through the enclosure, measuring distances, inspecting the barriers, retracing the path that had led to tragedy. The small gap in the railing that had allowed Lily to slip through was identified within minutes, a flaw so minor that it had never been considered a risk. Until now, the officials documented every inch of the scene, their careful work interrupted only by the occasional murmured exchange, their expressions unreadable as they processed the enormity of what they were witnessing. Mufasa, the lion who had been at the center of it all, remained in his holding area under close watch. The tranquilizer had worn off, but he had not returned to the main exhibit. He paced in his confined space, unaware of the storm raging beyond the walls that contained him. He was not a villain. He was not capable of remorse or guilt. He had simply acted on instinct, responding to a world that, for a brief moment, had made sense to him. But logic had no place in the court of public opinion. The outrage building outside the zoo's gates demanded retribution, demanded an end to the creature that had taken a child's life. Protesters gathered by the afternoon, their voices a mix of grief, anger, and blame. Some carried signs calling for justice for Lily. Others demanded that Mufasa be euthanized immediately. They chanted, their voices rising in waves of emotion, their grief turning into something sharp, something that needed an outlet. The zookeepers, many of whom had cared for Mufasa since he was a cub, remained inside, watching from a distance, their own sorrow unreadable beneath the weight of what was to come. The decision to put Mufasa down came quickly. Officials framed it as a necessity. Once a wild animal had killed a human, there was no going back. Even if he had only acted on instinct, even if he had not known the difference between a child and prey, the risk of it happening again was too great. There was no rehabilitation, no second chance. He had crossed a line, and the consequences were irreversible. But his fate was sealed before the sun had set that evening. The zoo prepared for his euthanization in silence. There was no ceremony, no final act of dignity. He was led into a separate area where the process would be carried out away from public view. The keepers who had once fed him, trained him, spoken to him as if he were something more than just a predator, were absent. They could not bring themselves to be there. And so, he died alone, his golden eyes closing for the last time, the weight of a tragedy he could not understand settling over him in his final breath. But the anger did not end with Mufasa's death. If anything, it only grew. The Thompson family, shattered by grief, turned their focus toward the institution that had allowed the nightmare to happen. The lawsuit came swiftly, an accusation of negligence, of failure, of a system that had allowed their daughter to fall into the path of a predator. Their lawyers spoke of ignored safety measures, of the unnoticed flaw in the barrier, of the seconds that had stretched too long between action and consequence. The zoo, once a beloved landmark of the community, became the center of a legal battle that would stretch for months, its reputation now marred by the stain of tragedy. The staff, many of whom had worked at Meadowbrook for decades, felt the shift immediately. Visitors stopped coming. Schools canceled field trips. Families that had once spent their weekends wandering through exhibits now avoided the zoo altogether. The once vibrant atmosphere, filled with the laughter of children and the excitement of discovery, became something subdued, something haunted. The lion exhibit was closed permanently, the enclosure left empty, a silent monument to what had happened there. The rock formations where Mufasa had once lounged remained, untouched and abandoned, a space that no animal would occupy again. Time passed, but the grief remained. The Thompson family, unable to bear the weight of staying in the town where they had lost their daughter, moved away, their home left vacant, its windows dark. The zoo struggled to recover, but the shadow of Lily's death never lifted. For those who had witnessed it, the memory never faded. The image of the tiny girl in the lion's domain, the desperate race to save her, the final, terrible moment when it became clear that she was already gone. In the end, Meadowbrook Zoo was never the same again. The tragedy had become part of its history, a story whispered between staff, a cautionary tale told in safety briefings and training sessions. The barriers were reinforced, the protocols rewritten, but none of it mattered. No one could forget. No one could undo what had been done. And so the zoo stood, quieter than it had ever been, carrying the weight of a life lost too soon. A place meant for wonder, now forever marked by sorrow.